It has already begun, though most won't realize it until it's too late to pivot. There are certain moments that don't announce themselves with fireworks or grand gestures. They arrive like a shift in gravity, a quiet but absolute pull towards something irreversible. That's the kind of day this is. Not because of the date on a calendar, but because of the way the internal clock begins ticking differently, as if something underneath the surface has been reprogrammed without warning. The invitation is subtle, but the consequence of ignoring it is not. This opening, whatever it is, doesn't ask for consent. It simply unfolds. And now that it has, everything that clings to the past will start to dissolve. Not all at once, but in the same way morning doesn't wait for night to agree before rising. So what is it that can't return to the old ways anymore? And more importantly, what quietly knew this was coming long before the mind caught up? What's coming next might just be the missing piece you didn't know you were looking for. Hit subscribe because the next message wasn't meant to be missed. Something in the pattern has accelerated, not in a chaotic runaway train sort of way, but like a sudden clearing of fog that makes everything ahead feel unnervingly immediate. This isn't about a date on a screen or a cryptic number sequence. It's more like standing at the threshold of an internal upgrade system that didn't wait for conscious approval to initiate. What's circulating in the atmosphere now carries the texture of raw momentum, an ignition current that refuses to be reasoned with. It isn't gentle, it pushes. This particular alignment, however it wants to be defined, feels unusually dense with symbolic voltage. It's as if the math of time took a deep breath and decided to multiply rather than add. So what exactly is this force trying to extract? What behavior, what narrative, what outworn version of self is it finally trying to dislodge from the system? And more importantly, why does part of the psyche cling so tightly to what was meant to be temporary scaffolding? Some moments don't arrive to deliver answers. They come to erase the wrong questions. And this is one of them. When a threshold like this emerges, the greatest obstacle isn't lack of readiness. It's misidentifying what's still being carried as necessary. In the space between what wants to go and what won't let go, the entire arc of personal evolution can stall. So much effort goes into forward motion that the backward pull often disguises itself as safety, logic, or identity. But not everything that's familiar is sacred. Some patterns were never meant to become permanent residents. Here's something worth pausing on. What's the one internal loop that keeps replaying even when everything else evolves? What belief, what unspoken agreement keeps threading itself into each attempt at progress? The invitation now is not just to envision the next chapter, but to close the drawer on the pages that no longer fit. And if something in this process has already begun stirring, what has it revealed? What has it tried to pry from the grip? Consider that question before moving on. It may be the only thing that matters. If you understood even part of this, it means the signal is reaching you. Subscribe. The rest will make sense soon enough. There's a strange edge in the air lately, isn't there? Almost as if the social mirror has developed a distortion, bending back images that feel unfamiliar, exaggerated, or just slightly off. When certain individuals begin behaving out of character, testing boundaries, reawakening conflicts long buried, or stirring old roles thought to be shed, it's rarely about coincidence. These disruptions often act more like pressure gauges, showing precisely where energy is leaking or identity is clinging. It's not about them, not entirely. It's more like the psyche is being shown its unsealed seams by external actors playing temporary parts. These moments are less about personal attack and more about precision calibration. Strange as it sounds, friction has a way of revealing exactly what's still reactive, what's still unhealed, and what's silently waiting to be witnessed. Ever wonder why the faces showing up now are the ones most entangled in past chapters? What if their timing isn't random? What if they have arrived not to pull things backward, but to show exactly where the old threads still live in the nervous system? That question alone might be worth coming back to later. The first taste of freedom rarely arrives dressed in calm. In fact, it's often chaos that signals something fundamental has unlatched. When movement accelerates beyond the familiar rhythm, structures built from old reflexes begin to fracture. Not because anything is broken, but because the system is finally shedding its restraints. There's a kind of turbulence that comes with stepping into alignment, like the way tectonic plates shift before forming new ground. It's misleading, though. Most expect liberation to feel light, quiet, smooth. But in truth, the early stages feel more like a spiritual centrifuge, disorienting, raw, electric. And that discomfort, it's not evidence of misdirection, it's momentum made visible. If a long-held identity suddenly begins to dissolve, is that collapse? Or is that space being made for something the mind hasn't yet named? Real freedom doesn't hold hands with ease in the beginning. But pause for a moment. What if that discomfort is not a sign of wrongness, but the very proof that the frequency has shifted? Has that occurred to anyone else lately? There's a particular kind of unrest that masquerades as misalignment, when in truth it's the early tremor of transformation. Much of what passes for identity has been constructed around the illusion of steady ground. Knowing the rules, predicting the pace, decoding patterns before stepping forward. But this current shift refuses to cooperate with that structure. It doesn't offer signposts or confirmations. It accelerates without warning, nudging the nervous system into territory where logic hasn't caught up yet. It's a strange thing, how quickly the absence of clarity is mistaken for failure. But what if clarity isn't the prerequisite? What if movement is the language of this moment and meaning is something that forms in its wake? Think about it. When was the last time something truly life-altering began with certainty? So if everything suddenly feels wobbly, non-linear, or suspended in translation, maybe that's not the problem. Maybe that's the point. And before assuming the compass is broken, could it be that the terrain itself has just changed? If you felt something here, like it was meant just for you, maybe it was. Subscribe. No need to explain it, just stay. What if the disruption isn't a detour, but a confirmation that alignment has already begun? There's a certain paradox to transformation. It rarely feels like a reward at the start. Instead, it peels back everything that doesn't belong, sometimes before the mind even agrees to let go. The nature of this current wave doesn't resemble discipline or trial. It feels more like a sculptor chipping away at unnecessary layers, revealing something that's been asking to emerge all along. The intensity isn't punishment, it's precision. It dismantles without negotiation, not to diminish, but to construct something that wouldn't otherwise fit beneath all the inherited weight. What if this isn't collapse at all, but the system making room for something requested in a forgotten moment of stillness? That question lingers, and maybe it should, because sometimes fulfillment doesn't arrive in silence. It shows up loud, unexpected, and wrapped in forms that the past version of the self never would have chosen, but the future one wouldn't trade. Is that what this is? Has anyone else noticed the pattern? There's a subtle fracture that forms each time authenticity is traded for approval. It often begins quietly, a diluted laugh, a softened truth, a silent agreement made for the sake of keeping the water still. Over time, those minor gestures of compliance stack like sediment, shaping a version of self that reflects expectation rather than essence. The problem isn't the occasional adaptation, it's when the adjustment calcifies into identity. A smile given in discomfort, a nod offered in resistance, a silence held in disagreement. These aren't harmless, they are edits, and edits, repeated often enough, become erasures. What begins as a gesture of diplomacy can quietly become a ritual of disappearance. So where is the line between compassion and self-abandonment? How often is peace kept at the expense of presence? It's worth sitting with that, because some masks don't just hide, they replace. And once worn too long, they become hard to take off without peeling away something vital underneath. Anyone else feeling that lately? That quiet urge to take the costume off the mid-scene? Not every shift is about being seen more clearly. Some are about becoming less divided on the inside. There's a misconception that growth demands volume, that presence requires disruption. But this isn't about echoing louder into rooms already filled with noise. It's about the quiet recalibration that happens when inner alignment becomes non-negotiable. The frequency of this moment isn't tuned to performance, it's tuned to integration. No more bending to fit into spaces too small for truth. No more sanding down edges to soothe another's discomfort. This isn't a call to provoke. It's a refusal to vanish, the version that treads lightly over its own voice, that filters every instinct through the lens of acceptability. That version doesn't survive the crossing point now underway. So here's something to consider. What if the next stage isn't asking for a louder self, but an undivided one? What gets left behind when coherence becomes the compass? Sit with that for a moment. Does anything come up? Something familiar? Or something ready to be released? Sometimes the brightest smile is the most exhausted. There's a subtle fatigue that builds when behavior is shaped more by accommodation than alignment. When the drive to maintain harmony quietly overrides the instinct to protect self-respect. Wearing gentleness like a uniform can begin as grace, but it mutates when used to mask friction that needs to be felt. The result? Energy leaks, not just emotionally, but energetically, as though each nod, each "it's fine," chips away at something far deeper than mood. This isn't a critique of kindness. True kindness has depth, backbone, clarity. The distortion appears when that kindness demands silence in the face of erosion. And perhaps more importantly, when it convinces others to stay close to a character that was only ever meant to be temporary. So here's a hard question worth pausing for. How much of the current relational dynamic is built on a version of the self that no longer exists and never truly did? What happens when authenticity is no longer negotiable, even if it disrupts the script others have learned to expect? There comes a moment when the performance of peace begins to collapse under its own weight, not because the act was weak, but because it was never sustainable. And in that moment, a boundary isn't just needed, it becomes inevitable. There's a misleading narrative that stillness must come at the cost of truth, that spiritual presence is measured by how much discomfort one can silently absorb. But what if that's not wisdom? It's weariness dressed up as virtue. A line drawn clearly isn't always defiance. Sometimes it's clarity, finely spoken. The shift isn't about rebellion, it's about release. When expression no longer filters itself through layers of second-guessing, the result isn't chaos, it's coherence. And the ones attuned to real presence don't recoil at that. They breathe easier around it. So here's the invitation. What if the truest version doesn't need to be proved or justified, just permitted? And what would it take to step into a room, not to be accepted, but simply to be real? Let that land for a moment. What answers begin to rise in its silence? Some thresholds don't ask for resolution, they demand truth. And in this one, the illusion of healing is beginning to unravel where the pain still hums beneath rehearsed acceptance. It's easy to mistake interpretation for integration, to weave betrayal into poetic language and call it peace. But the body keeps its own archive. And sometimes that polished lesson still burns at the edges when recalled aloud. That's the space this current energy seems to be illuminating, the space between cognitive closure and emotional release. Forgiveness is often named before it's felt. It can be performed, intellectualized, even spiritualized, while the ache remains buried like an unfinished sentence. So maybe this isn't about forgiving more. Maybe it's about letting go of the need to package what happened in a way that makes it digestible. Is it possible that real release doesn't ask for a story at all? That maybe the wound doesn't need to be rewritten? It just needs to be let go without the script? Pause there for a second. Does anything stir? A memory? A phrase that still has heat in it? What might happen if that, too, no longer needed a name? There's a peculiar shape that resentment takes when it passes through the filter of spiritual language. It becomes polished, presentable, almost noble in tone. But beneath that sheen, the energy remains unchanged. That so-called blessing, it's often spoken not in celebration, but in subtle defiance. A carefully rehearsed phrase that still holds a trace of venom beneath the wisdom. It's not forgiveness, it's armor. A narrative curated not for healing, but for protection. And to be fair, that instinct is entirely human. After all, who wouldn't want to wrap their pain in something elegant, something that explains it away without having to truly sit in the rawness of it? But protection is not the same as freedom. A shield, no matter how poetic, is still a defense. And that defense often keeps the wound suspended just beneath the surface, unresolved but well decorated. Here's the real question. Is the story being told to release the past or to guard against ever repeating it? And if it's the latter, what would it mean to live without needing that shield anymore? Some energies can't be dressed up, no matter how eloquent the language becomes. A grudge, softened by insight and wrapped in spiritual phrases, still vibrates at the frequency of attachment. And this particular phase, this swift, unrelenting corridor of movement, doesn't respond to the surface story. It reads weight. It detects the residue. What hasn't been metabolized begins to show itself not in words, but in resistance, in slowness, in internal drag. This isn't judgment, it's mechanics. Acceleration requires clarity, and clarity can't coexist with hidden anchors. There's a kind of honesty that the current atmosphere seems to demand, not in confession, but in energetic release. Because even if the mind has moved on, the emotional body might still be negotiating a contract with the past. And if that bond is still active, it creates friction. So the question becomes, what is being dragged forward that was never meant to make the trip? And what if that thing, still faintly smoldering under layers of meaning, is what the portal is quietly waiting to see surrendered? Would that change what needs to be let go? Even the most polished narratives can become armor, especially the ones dressed in wisdom, recited fluently, and kept close like credentials earned through pain. The lesson that keeps being referenced, the growth that came from it, those may be real, but they often arrive stitched to a tension that never quite relaxes. This particular passage, this current undercurrent of momentum, doesn't dismantle what's being held. It simply reveals the fingerprints left behind, not through confrontation, but through reflection. It peels back the story and scans for density, for the sediment that still hasn't dissolved. It's not looking for eloquence, it's looking for frequency. So the question becomes unavoidable. What's being carried that looks like wisdom, but feels like defense? What memory still hums with static, even after all the processing has been done? And more importantly, what would shift if the energy invested in the explanation was finally released with no commentary at all? Let that settle. Does something come to mind that still carries charge, even when wrapped in grace? Some teachings carry weight long after their usefulness has passed. The memory of pain, even when transformed into insight, can become a relic, honored, revisited, repeated, until it begins to shape more than just understanding. It shapes identity. There's power in the story, yes, but there's also gravity. And the longer it's held, the more it begins to anchor rather than elevate. This current energetic field isn't interested in what wisdom was mined from the wound. It's asking something more disruptive. Can the entire construct, lesson and loss alike, be set down? Not with resistance, not with ceremony, just released. Not because it wasn't real, but because it's no longer needed. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Strength feels familiar, but freedom feels unfamiliar. And unfamiliar doesn't always feel safe. So what happens if the story ends without the usual punctuation? If the next move comes not from understanding, but from instinct? Would the clarity eventually return? Or, more radically, has it been waiting just beyond the moment of surrender this whole time? This current pulse doesn't speak the language of planning. It speaks in sparks, in sudden openings, in friction that demands response, not analysis. It bypasses the ritual of confirmation and moves instead on instinct, raw and fast. The energy now circulating is not structured like a staircase. It's more like a current, wild, magnetic, non-linear. And the ones trying to chart its path before stepping into it are missing its nature entirely. There is no map for this, only motion, only trust in the act of movement itself. Waiting for certainty here is like trying to predict the shape of lightning. What's required isn't precision, it's participation. So the ones still gathering evidence, still negotiating timing, may find themselves standing still as the path opens and closes without them. Is that harsh? Maybe. But maybe it's also merciful, because momentum, real momentum, requires departure before destination. And clarity in this landscape only belongs to those willing to move first and understand later. So, who's still asking for signs? And what if the only sign left is how loud the stillness feels in their chest?